A warm welcome to everyone for our PCQuest 35 years journey from 1987 to 2022. Today, we will be discussing the Indian e-commerce boom. To discuss that, we have a pioneer in the form of Sanjeev Bikhchandani, co-founder InfoEdge-Naukri.com. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah. So I'll get straight to it. It was quite a long time back, in the 1990s, the late 1990s, when the internet came, the buzz around e-commerce began. So if you can go back to the very early days, what was the state of e-commerce in India at that time? And what was the promise? And what about the early successes?
So I will broaden the definition of e-commerce to include all internet-based businesses.
Sure.
I think e-commerce is a more recent phenomenon where you're selling products online, although there were early attempts, but they did not scale up or succeed. But if you look at early forays into internet-based businesses, right, they began around 1996 in India, maybe 95, 96. The internet itself came into India in late 95, but was very low penetration. So we launched Naukri in April 97. And at that time, when we launched, it was estimated that there were about 14,000 internet accounts in the country. With shared account usage, it meant that there may have been a couple of 100,000 users, but we don't know exactly how many, but maybe that many. We had no idea where the internet will go. There was no such thing as .com valuations. There were almost no venture capitalists in India at that time. So if you wanted to actually do something on the internet and start a business, you had to figure out how you're going to be sustainable, which meant there was not enough capital. Internet connections and internet access was dial-up. You had to dial up through a modem. You needed a telephone line. Mobile phones had just come in. There was no data on the mobile phone other than SMSs. Right, and up until the mid 90s, there was a waiting list of 8 years to get a landline. Right, so essentially, poor infrastructure, low capital, small market, somehow, make do and get by, do more with less, try and get a revenue model, try and get money from customers, and do something that they want and is useful, and therefore you can sustain yourself. And that was the era and environment in which we began. And it was not perceived to be a huge opportunity. Therefore, there weren't too many large companies doing stuff on the internet, which for small companies like us, startups like us, it meant there was no competition also. And that is good for us. Right? And that's how we started. So I think very many young early stage startups that succeed with less capital usually go into frontier areas, right, which are perceived to be too niche and too small for large companies to be interested in. And then they try and make that happen. And some of them succeed. And that's what happened to us. So that was the environment then. We launched in an office out of my residence. Right? We could not afford to rent office space. The power supply was unreliable. The voltage would be 160, in East Delhi, where I was staying. The ACs wouldn't work. We didn't have any. We had only one AC in any case. We couldn't even afford long battery backups because batteries were expensive. So we had a UPS, but only a 20-minute backup, which basically meant when the power would go, which would be quite frequently in the summer, people were sitting idle for several hours. But that is how it was then, and that was life, right?
So you're right. It was a very tough beginning, and I guess there was no such thing as e-commerce. It was all internet business.
Tough beginning. I don't know. I don't know what tough beginning. See, it was tough in some ways.
Okay.
It was also easier in some ways. There was no competition. So you could make your mistakes. You could make them without too much money. You could learn from them, and you could, figure out how to do business, how to make money, without spending too much money, and without too much competition. So from that perspective, it is easier. On several other perspectives, tougher. So each era has its own degrees of toughness and comforts. So I wouldn't say we had it much tougher. We had it much tougher in some ways. We had it much easier in some ways.
But I guess things then radically changed because the internet came, you had the dot-com bust in the US. And by 2000s, I think things settled down and there was a stable trajectory of growth. So can you speak about the e-commerce scene in the 2000s, maybe the
So I'll tell
first
you.
decade?
I'll tell you. There was a very short-lived first wave of funding of internet companies in India between 98 and 2000, just 2 years, right? So there was a dot-com boom and bubble in the US. Some of that spilled over into India in terms of investor interest, in terms of people starting internet companies and raising money. But the bust happened in March, April 2000, before too many companies got funded. Almost nobody got big money, and very few got second rounds. Right now, that shortage of capital between 2000 and 2004 meant that very few companies survived. Most shut down. Most VCs left India. Right? But the ones that survived, a Naukri, a Shadi, a Bharat Matrimony, an India Mart, a Make My Trip, they all went on to become big, valuable companies. Because they came through the tough test of that dot-com bubble meltdown. And they were able to survive because they were getting customer revenue and they were breaking even. Right? So while there were very few that survived that, those that did, almost all went on to become big, valuable companies. In 2004 or 5, the early beginnings of venture capital coming back into India were witnessed. Right? I think one turning point in 2004, I think, was when Bazi was sold to eBay. And I think that began the interest of venture capital coming back into India and getting interested in Indian startups again. It was slow initially, but I think by 2007 or 8 or 6, it had begun in right earnest. But then came the global financial crisis. And that was a setback for a couple of years. But then venture capital persisted coming back because with TARP, with the Fed infusing liquidity, more venture capital came in. So to a large extent, and it has continued since then, to a large extent, I think we have been influenced and benefited in terms of venture capital by global liquidity and global fund availability. So I'd like to point out here that maybe 95% of risk equity capital in India is from overseas. The Indian pool of risk capital, which means venture capital, is small. There are some angel networks. There are some family offices. There are some corporate development programs in companies. And there are some VC funds which do raise some Indian money. But it is still not mainstream investment category for very many people and institutions. So in terms of fund availability, you are crucially dependent on overseas capital inflows. And that's important to understand that. But on the back of this fund availability, you also had a whole lot of newer entrepreneurs saying, I want to do a startup. So I think if you look at the number of people trying to do startups now, their quality, how smart they are, how qualified they are, there's a new kind of entrepreneur in the ecosystem now as compared to, say, 20 or 30 years ago when we were starting out. So in those days, if you were from a middle-class family, you were qualified from an IIT or an IIM or a good college, right? Your aspiration was to do, you go overseas, or if you want to stay in India, you will work for a large corporation as a manager or a technology person and rise up the ranks over there. Right? This thing of this aspiration of doing a startup, it becoming a mainstream aspiration, is something which is a more recent phenomenon in the last 10, 12 years. I think this large number of entrepreneurs trying to do this has made a huge difference. So a large amount of capital, meeting a large number of high quality entrepreneurs starting out, in an environment like India, where there is massive, massive increase in penetration of the net and of mobile phones and smartphones at the same time, this triage, this confluence of these three things, I think is what has created and given rise to a lot of the startups and unicorns that we are seeing today.
That's quite fascinating. I mean, like the first 15 years, 1995, 96, the internet came, and then 98 to 2000 funding, the crisis, 2005, another funding, 2008, 2010 crisis. So I think that the first 15 years you've described wonderfully. And also like you have set it up for the last 10 years. So maybe if you could just, elaborate more on this last 10 years, because we've had the entry of foreign players, the startup like IIT startup, it has become a boom, especially in the last 2 years. And then I think the mobile data revolution has also contributed to that. So can we say like Indian e-commerce finally came of age in the 2010s?
I think it will finally come of age when companies become profitable, right? But has it acquired scale? Answer is yes. But are there large sections of Indian society and population that are left out of this boom? Answer also is yes. Right. So India is, I guess, a mishmash of several things happening at the same time. People who are benefiting and buying in this e-commerce boom. People who are making it happen, the startups and the entrepreneurs and the employees there. People who are investing into these startups and then earning a return. People who, large corporations, such as the Tatas or Reliance, getting into this and acquiring companies. The entry of foreign players, Amazon or Walmart, right, doing this. So it's pretty much all happening right now, right? Now, in all of this, if you have a backdrop of a fast-growing economy, then there will be large successes of a large number of people. If the economy, however, slows down, and if global liquidity dries up, if the Fed raises interest rates 9 times in the next 2 years, as they have promised to do, or indicate they might do, or some commentators believe they will do, right? Then it's a different environment, right? So all of this, it remains to be seen how it will pan out.
Yeah, and another thing which we just can't like escape discussing is the pandemic era. So the last 2 years have been mad. I mean, one, there was a tragedy, and second, there was the absolute explosion of technology, e-commerce. So I'd like to know it from like your point of view. How did you view the last 2 years? The fillip that e-commerce got and the trends, etc.
So I'll tell you, in the beginning, say lockdown March 24th, 2020. So April to June 2020, first quarter of that financial year, Naukri witnessed a 44% decline in negative growth, 44% in billings. We were still profitable because Naukri is highly profitable. So survival was at threat, but there was no light at the end of the tunnel. We didn't know what will happen because there was no vaccine at that stage. We had no clue where we'd end up. We had no idea how long this lockdown will continue. We had no idea when demand will come back. So I think very many companies were very badly hit at that stage in the first 3 months, simply because the economy just froze. Right? In Zomato, I remember, restaurants shut down except for kitchens, right? So the dining out business was over, which is one half of Zomato's business. It took a month or two for the government to clarify and for the last constable on the road, police constable, to understand that if a Zomato delivery boy is going out to deliver food, it's an essential service. So don't stop it, right? With this migration of labor from big cities back to smaller towns and villages back home, a large number of Zomato delivery boys also left. So you were left with a truncated set of delivery boys who were not being able to go out of their homes for a couple of months to deliver. Customers are not ordering because they were not confident allowing a third person into the house to deliver, right? So everybody had a huge setback. Policy Bazaar, you could not go and do a KYC because the people could not go out to do KYC and meet the customer. The customer didn't want to meet anybody anyway. And the lenders didn't want to give loans in any case because there was a moratorium. So both these businesses, which today are listed and valuable, was seriously threatened in Q1 of 2021, along with Naukri, right? And then the bounce back started, July onwards, with the opening out, right? And it bounced back a bit, and we said, okay, fine, things are coming back. Let's see, and bit by bit, it came back to a point where it was now doing better than ever before. Because although restaurants dining out was still not a habit, right? But people are ordering in much more than earlier, right? The moratorium for the loans was over, so now people wanted to lend and people wanted to borrow. So, Paisa Bazaar was back in business. Policy Bazaar, the policy part of the business, was booming because of health insurance. So I think this transition, and Naukri bounced back because certainly now in the last 3-4 quarters, there's been a massive shortage of tech talent. Because as India and the world goes digital and remote, and you want more and more tech talent, not just in tech companies, also in non-tech companies. And we are seeing that, right? So now business is back. It's been a huge boom for us, for several of our industry companies. And hopefully from here, things will get even better.
So, I mean, thanks. It's been a pretty long journey. If you look first 20 years, there have been a lot of ups and downs, but I think last 6-7 years, there was so much volatility. The mobile, data revolution, the, startup funding revolution, and the pandemic first crash, then the tech boom. I think 20, the economy shrank, 21, it grew again, and 22 also its growth. So it's a very tough question. How do you see the next 10 years of e-commerce, both in India and the world, in terms of trends? I mean, or maybe less.
I have no clue. Okay, quite honestly. So I'll tell you one thing. I graduated from college in 1984, right, and took on my first job. And if I look back on the economy and industry then, right, I began my career in advertising and then moved to consumer marketing. Okay, if I look at the economy and industry then versus now, it's just a massive sea change. But one thing stands out. All the companies and industries and sectors that have created growth, employment, buzz, and have made headlines and have attracted investments, very few of those industries even existed back in 84. IT services barely existed. IT-enabled services did not exist. Internet did not exist. Mobile telephony did not exist. Private sector banks, there were some private sector banks, but not like this. Private sector insurance companies did not exist. Private airlines did not exist. Private TV channels did not exist. Okay, so all of these have come in the last 35 years. It's not been a revolution, it's been an evolution, right? And therefore, in 1984, if you had asked me what will business be like 38 years from now, I would have said something, but I would not have predicted this. Now, what will business be like 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now? Now, I'll say something, but it'll probably not be what will actually happen because predictability is hard. But I do know there is the 3 or 4 things that will influence the way things move. One clearly is technology, right? It is on the back of technology that a lot of these new industries have come up. Right? The second clearly is enterprise. I think the new kind of entrepreneur will make a huge difference in India and has already made a huge difference. So the third is capital, and the kind of capital influencing into India we have not seen in the past, especially in risk capital. So technology, enterprise, capital, and if the Indian economy grows, it creates a larger and larger market. So these 4 things, I think, will continue to drive and be the driving force of what will happen. And the 5th is going to be regulation. How the government deregulates, regulates, allows some things to happen and some other things do not happen. These 5 things, I think, will shape the future.
Thank you for your time. That was quite fascinating. We went through the history, present, and also like future. You stuck your neck out and make the future predictions. So I'd really be interested in you to discuss these 5 after a few years, because these are like
Absolutely.
major trends. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, yeah,
Happy to do that. Thank you
yeah,
so much for inviting me.
yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.